Hello and welcome back to another 2022, good grief, it still feels weird to say, episode of the Single Malt Review. And we've got something a little bit international there.
Ah, yes. Now, Shinshu Mars have been distilling in Japan since the middle of the 20th century and producing whiskey since the mid-1980s. We have here is a blended whiskey. And we've talked in the past about the new Japanese distilling industry regulations on what can and cannot be called whiskey, or Japanese whiskey in particular. And what I think we have here, in this newest incarnation of Mars Iwai, is a result of those regulations coming into effect.
Yeah.
What we have here is, yes, as I say, Mars Iwai blended whiskey. Now, this used to be called Japanese blended whiskey. Only those words are no longer here. There's nothing on the label, on any of the packaging, says that it's Japanese whiskey, or even it is distilled in Japan. And we've known in the past a lot of Japanese whiskey has either proudly or covertly used quantities of spirit imported from other countries, but is now often packaged and sold as world whiskey in compliance with the new regulations. So I believe, though I'm not certain, that what we have here is likely to be a similar beastie. It contains spirits imported from other countries, then blended and matured by Mars at their facilities.
Yeah, so a whiskey that has not changed, it's just being maybe a little bit more, even obliquely in this case, honest about its origins and makeup.
There is minimal information available online based on my admittedly fairly brief searches, since Shinshu Mars don't maintain a commercial English language website for their products, and most of the reviews I could find looked at older incarnations of this when it was still labelled as Japanese whiskey. What I did see there was it was often described as having a very bourbon-like grain bill, corn dominant with some malted barley. What we have here tells us nothing about the grain mash bill, but that it's matured in bourbon, sherry, and American white oak casks.
Yeah. So which part of this actually has to do with Japan is a bit more tenuous. It was bottled there, I guess, and it was blended there.
I assume matured as well from the, I suppose, imported new make spirits.
But goodness knows what else. And this is, of course, this is all repercussions of anyone that wasn't on the news on that one. The newly regulated Japanese whiskey industry, which was, to put it, to oversimplify it, they more or less rubber stamped the regulations from Scotch malt whiskey onto the Japanese market, which makes sense because they make more or less the same thing and they want to protect it for more or less the same reasons. And so we're starting to see things pivot, and this is certainly a case of that. But the pivot in question seems to be less about compliance with the new regulations and more about changing the label around to avoid them, kind of a thing. So it's not where we were never going to see more Japanese whiskey, because they probably are running at max capacity over there, because why wouldn't you be? We are simply seeing maybe more honestly packaged Japanese whiskey, or not Japanese whiskey, as the case may be. So
the question that remains is whether this one is not labelled as Japanese whiskey because it doesn't comply with the restrictions around malted grain and so forth. Maybe that corn component, if it's there, means it can't be called Japanese whiskey, but it can be called whiskey, or because it does use, as I suspect but can't be sure, imported spirit.
So, who knows? Enough of this conjecture. That's what I say. Is it good? That's the question we ask around
40%
here.
ABV bottling.
Now
It's a rich bourbon-esque nose,
is quite weird.
but quite sweet. Even perhaps it's sweeter than bourbon. More lighter honey characters. Little hints of sherry cask.
That's really weird. There's a perfumed quality to that. There's a bit of sort of sandalwood sweetness. It is a very sweet nose.
Yeah, there's a bit of incense. Yeah, that's it.
I get very little in the way of malt off this. Grain, certainly.
Yeah, I did come across a review of the previous bottling, previous labelling of Mars Iwai, which suggested something like 75% corn and 25 malted barley.
Very weird. Because, you normally wouldn't even go into your, the grain bill for your grain whiskey. You'd simply say, this proportion of grain whiskey went in, there you go. They certainly wouldn't bother putting that on Scottish blends.
That was from a review blog I'm not familiar with, so I don't know what their source for that fact was. It's simply numbers I came across in my searching.
So, we'll say this is, there's a bit of there's quite a bit of fire on that
Yeah.
on that nose, despite it only being 40%. Although we could easily put that down to the heat of the day because it remains an absolute scorcher over here. It's pretty cask influence. It's pretty wooden. Not particularly. There is a honeyedness there, but it's not particularly dominant. And there's quite a lot of floral and a wee bit of spice. It's interesting.
Well, the tasting notes on here suggest light and sweet with floral fragrances and notes of sweet pear and dark cacao. I can certainly see some of that. Yeah, and on the tongue, we're going to look for a soft body, flavours of dried fig and allspice, a soft malt finish, hints of ginger cookies, and honeyed milk.
Well, let's see.
That is very sweet and very smooth. A good sappy oak timber finish.
That's really weird. That is the most whiskey full stop taste. That is like nothing. It's like almost everything.
Yeah.
It is akin to almost nothing. That is not like Scotch blended whiskey in the slightest.
My mind is leading me to think that if you took bourbon and then plopped it into a sherry cask and rematured it for goodness knows what reason, I think you get something like this.
I think it is closer to bourbon than anything else. I think if you... My best way of describing this would be if you took bourbon and then aged it in old wood rather than fresh oak, so you don't get all that maple syrupy weight and sweetness.
Yeah.
This is, I think, close to what you would get out of it. But
it's a light body, very easy to sip. It would go amazingly in a mixed drink or with an ice cube.
This would go well with ice. I should have prepared my ice pile, but never mind. I'll forego it this time. I think this would go well with ice. I'll bet the price is a little prohibitive for that kind of adventure with this one. But
as it is a whiskey out of Japan, it does cost close to what you'd pay for, say, a 10 or 12-year-old age statement single malt whiskey.
Yeah, the finish is pretty short. It's fairly smooth on the palate. That
oodles of honey and vanilla and florals and spices.
Yeah, that slight nasal savagery doesn't seem to go onto the doesn't quite go onto the palate. So it's pretty. It'll treat you fairly gently. This one.
There is quite a lot of what I think of as corn whiskey flavour there, but not in the electrical fire acridness we've found in some corn whiskey in the past.
There's a bit of rye to it as well, actually, although that just could be the confluence of other flavours making me think of it. I'm really struggling to think of who this whiskey is for. Like, why would you... I mean, you make this whiskey because it's cheap to make, and you can chuck a label on it and say it comes from Japan, and so it will sell. But in terms of who this is for, taste-wise, it's really difficult to put my finger on it. I guess
now, since if Mars are producing single malt Japanese whiskey and labelled as such, if they can no longer include international spirits in those blended into that and still call it Japanese whiskey, they may well be using that stock in other ways, like keeping up their blending skill and producing an affordable and more economically priced whiskey as well. Let them use up those existing, import deals or stocks of spirit.
I think the cynical part of me, which is most of me, wonders if the person this whiskey is for is the person that wants to have a bottle of whiskey that says Japan somewhere on it because it's fashionable. Because there's no other... Unless you would liked this exact taste, and that's possible, it is quite unique.
Yeah.
There's just so many other options the world over that are just so much cheaper.
Yeah. This one is in the Japanese whiskey section, of course, even though it is in no way calling itself a Japanese whiskey.
I think this might be a bit of a fashion statement, I think. Although
Quite
that
possibly.
so goes all Japanese whiskey these days. But yeah, it's odd. It's odd, and I don't think it's a whiskey that's been made for me, especially like a suspicious drinker such as myself.
It does take water fairly well. It's certainly not harmed it.
We look there. That's probably got the fruit moving.
It has a little, yes. I think it's exacerbating, bringing to the fore some of the sherry cask. It's cut through some of the sandalwood and fresh timber.
Yeah, a bit more liveliness with the water in there. I still, I'm trying to... Scores for this one, it's for a blend, it's a very good blend. It's nice, it's rich, there's heaps going on, plenty to think about. So it's probably up around probably 78 for me for blends, but I think given I'm not exactly sure what the price was here. I think they're probably asking a lot for what if you broke down into its fundamental parts. If you took that Japan off the label, wouldn't be sitting nearly as high on the shelf as it is. But I say that's just a very suspicious, cynical way of looking at it.
Like I say, for the same price, you get potentially a 10 or 12-year-old single malt, or a age statement bourbon, or 2 bottles of a non-age statement American whiskey like rye or corn.
Oh, what's your verdict? Where does the hammer fall for you?
For me, 83 points. I like the flavour. It is easy to drink. It's sweet. It's accessible. It is easy to dive into. It is really interestingly perfumey, and there's a little mystery around it, of course. There are things we don't know, which I would like to know, but at the same time, it's, well, if anything is honest, it doesn't try to call itself Japanese whiskey, so we can make our own conclusions based on that.
Interesting stuff.
It's honestly not one I recommend based on the information versus price and so on, but I can certainly recommend drinking it because it tastes good, honestly.
The quagmire of Japanese whiskey ever deepens. What a strange place. What a strange place, and it's only going to get weirder as these regulations set further into the market. So, it'll be a rocky road for them this year. Anyway, Slanja, thanks for joining us. We will be right back with something else.